Forgiveness is not the same thing as welcome. I want to say that before anything else, before any image, before any description of what is moving in someone's energy in your direction, because I think it is the most important distinction in this entire reading and it deserves the first sentence. Someone wanting your forgiveness does not automatically mean they deserve your return. Hold that. Now let us look at what is actually happening. I see a figure sitting in the particular stillness of someone who has run out of distractions, not a dramatic stillness. The ordinary kind that arrives at the end of a long enough day when there is nothing left to occupy the hands or redirect the mind, and the thing that has been waiting patiently in the background simply steps forward and takes up the whole room. You stepped forward in their awareness, in their chest, in the specific hollow place that has been there since whatever happened between you left its mark. And the size of what stepped forward surprised them, not because they did not know it was there, but because they had been successful enough at managing its volume that encountering it at full amplitude, unmediated, without the buffer of distraction, felt almost like meeting it for the first time. That is what missing someone terribly actually means. Not the softened, wistful version, the kind that arrives at full volume when the defenses are down. Let me describe what the missing actually looks like from inside their experience, because I think the specifics matter more here than the general shape. It is not romantic longing in the simple sense. Though that is present, it is not the whole picture. What I see is a compound thing, several layers running simultaneously, each one adding weight to the others. There is the absence of you as a person, the specific irreplaceable texture of your presence, how you think, how you communicate, the particular quality of attention you bring that most people in this person's world do not come close to replicating. That absence has a physical dimension to it. The body registers certain kinds of loss before the mind finishes processing them. Underneath that is something harder for them to articulate. The absence of who they were with you, a version of themselves they have not had reliable access to since you left, or since things fell apart, or since whatever distance formed between you made being that version of themselves impossible. That second layer of missing is the one that catches them off guard at unexpected moments, because it is not obviously connected to you on the surface and then reveals itself to be completely connected when they actually trace it back. And underneath both of those, something raw still. The weight of knowing they played a role in creating the distance. That third layer is the one that does not negotiate. The first two can be managed with enough new experience, enough time, enough intentional redirection. The third one simply waits. It does not respond to distraction or effort or the passage of time the way ordinary longing does. It has a different mechanism entirely. It gets louder the longer it goes unaddressed, which is exactly why this person has arrived at this point. Not because the missing reached a fever pitch they could no longer ignore, though that is part of it, but because the accountability layer, the knowing that something was done and not corrected, has been compounding quietly beneath everything else and has finally reached a volume that makes forward motion in any other direction impossible. You cannot outrun genuine guilt forever. It catches you eventually. This person has been caught, and I want to stay with that third layer for a moment because it is where the forgiveness piece lives and it deserves real attention. Guilt, when it is genuine, has a specific quality that distinguishes it from the guilt people perform for strategic purposes. Genuine guilt does not conveniently arrive only in moments when it might produce a desired result. It arrives at 3 in the morning when there is nothing to be gained from feeling it. It arrives in the middle of ordinary Tuesday afternoons for no apparent reason. It interrupts unrelated thoughts with the specific, uninvited image of a moment where a different choice was available and was not taken. What I am reading in this person is the genuine kind, the kind that has been showing up without invitation for long enough that they can no longer maintain the comfortable narrative that what happened was not that significant, or was equally distributed, or was simply the inevitable outcome of circumstances rather than the direct result of choices they made. The narrative has collapsed. What remains underneath it is accountability they have been trying to avoid and can no longer outrun. There is an image forming now, and I want to describe it carefully because it sits at the emotional center of this reading. I see hands, open, not reaching, open. The specific posture of someone who has set something down and is showing the empty palms, not as a gesture of defeat, but as a gesture of offering, of saying, without words, I am not holding anything back. What I have is visible. What I want is visible. I am not maneuvering here. Open hands are the posture of genuine surrender, not the kind that asks nothing in return. The kind that acknowledges that whatever is given in response, including nothing, including a door that stays closed, including a forgiveness that is extended without a reopening of the connection, is a legitimate answer that they have no right to argue with. They are arriving at your door energetically, if not yet physically, with open hands. And what they are placing in those open hands is not a request dressed as an apology. It is the actual apology first, standing on its own before any ask is attached to it. That sequence matters. An apology that arrives already attached to a request is not fully an apology. It is a negotiation wearing an apology's clothes. The distinction between the two is something your Virgo perception is more than capable of detecting in real time. And I want you to trust that detection when it is activated rather than talking yourself out of it in the interest of giving someone the benefit of the doubt they may not have fully earned. When what arrives is the genuine sequence, apology first, standing alone, before any ask gets attached, that is a different encounter entirely. That is what I see coming. I want to be direct about something that I think this reading requires me to address plainly. Forgiveness, real forgiveness, is not something that happens in a single moment because someone says the right words. It is not a switch that flips when an apology arrives that sounds sincere enough. It is a process, sometimes a slow one, that happens inside the person doing the forgiving, on their own timeline and at their own pace, entirely independent of the timeline of the person requesting it. You are not obligated to have completed that process simply because they have arrived at the point of asking. If you have not finished forgiving, that is not a failure on your part. That is an honest account of where you actually are. And anyone arriving with a genuine rather than strategic apology understands and accepts that. They do not present the apology and then expect immediate absolution as the natural and required next step. If the person coming toward you is making the apology conditional on an immediate positive response from you, that is information worth having. But here is what I also want to say, and I want to say it with the same directness. Forgiveness, when it finally arrives in you, does something that has nothing to do with the other person. It releases something in you, a weight that has been sitting in your chest that you may have become so accustomed to carrying that you no longer notice how much it is costing you to keep it there. The low-level hum of unresolved hurt that has been running in the background of your energy, affecting things you would not necessarily connect to the situation, quietly consuming resources you need for everything else in your life. Forgiveness is not a gift you give to the person who hurt you. It is a gift you give to yourself. And the question of whether you extend it and when and what form that extension takes is entirely yours. It does not require their apology to begin. It does not require any particular action from them at all. It is something that happens in you, for you, at whatever pace your own healing actually requires. What their apology does is simply make the conversation available. Whether you have that conversation and what comes of it is another question entirely. What their apology does is simply make the conversation available. Whether you have that conversation and what comes of it is another question entirely. And I want to name something about that question that often gets skipped over in readings like this one. The conversation, if you choose to have it, does not have to conclude anywhere specific. It does not have to end in reunion or closure or any other particular destination that either of you arrives with in mind. It can simply be the conversation, two people in the same space, one of them saying something true and the other one receiving it, and then both of them discovering from inside that experience what, if anything, becomes possible from there. Removing the pressure of a predetermined outcome from the conversation makes it possible for the actual thing to emerge naturally, rather than being forced into a shape it may not be ready to take. If and when you have that conversation, go in with open ears rather than a conclusion already written. Let me ask you something. I want you to answer only to yourself. Is there something specific that happened between you and this person that you have not yet been able to fully articulate, even in your own private thinking? Something that sits underneath the more obvious grievances, harder to name, but carrying more weight than the things you have been able to clearly identify. Sometimes the hardest thing to forgive is not the most obvious thing. It is the specific betrayal of an expectation you did not know you were holding until it was violated. The disappointment that is difficult to name because naming it requires admitting how much you were hoping for something that never arrived. If something like that is present for you, it deserves acknowledgement before any conversation about forgiveness goes further. Tell me in the comments if you want. Sometimes saying the unnamed thing somewhere outside your own head is the first step toward understanding what you actually need in order to move through it. Let me return to the person coming back, because there are things in their energy I have not yet fully described that I think matter for how you navigate this. I see movement, real movement. Not the theoretical kind of someone who has decided they will eventually do something at some unspecified point. The kind of movement that has already begun, that has a direction and a pace and a quality of intention, that has moved past the rehearsal stage into the actual doing. They are coming not because circumstances became convenient, because continuing not to was no longer possible, because whatever internal threshold separates intention from action has been crossed, and the crossing was not comfortable or easy, and they did it anyway. That choice, made in the absence of comfort or ease, is where I look when I am trying to assess whether what someone is bringing is genuine or strategic. Strategy waits for the right moment. Genuine feeling, when it has finally reached its limit, moves regardless of the moment. This moved regardless. There is something I want to name about this reading specifically that distinguishes it from other readings about someone returning. The missing in this one is not primarily about what they want from you. In some situations, someone comes back because they have assessed the alternatives and found them lacking, because they have run a cost-benefit calculation and determined that returning is now the more advantageous option. That kind of return carries a particular energy, self-interested, primarily oriented toward what they stand to gain rather than what they owe. That is not what I am reading here. What I am reading is something more uncomfortable for them and more meaningful for you. A return that is primarily motivated by something they owe rather than something they want. A need to correct something, to look at what they did directly and say so without the protective softening of justification or context. The missing is real, but it is secondary to the accountability. That order of priorities is significant. It suggests that even if you were to say no, even if the response to their coming back were a clearly closed door, something in them would need to have made the attempt anyway, not for the outcome, for the integrity of finally doing what they know they should have done. That order of priorities is significant. It suggests that even if you were to say no, even if the response to their coming back were a clearly closed door, something in them would need to have made the attempt anyway, not for the outcome, for the integrity of finally doing what they know they should have done. I want to say something about what that kind of return requires from the person making it, because I think it tends to be underappreciated. Returning to someone you hurt primarily to acknowledge what you did rather than to secure a particular response requires a specific kind of courage that is distinct from the courage required to pursue something you want. The pursuit courage has a motivating reward at the end of it. This kind of courage has no guaranteed reward. It may produce nothing except the discomfort of standing in front of someone you damaged and saying so directly. That is not an easy thing to do. Most people avoid it indefinitely rather than face it. The fact that this person is not avoiding it indefinitely tells you something that their words alone could not. I want to close this reading on something that I think matters more than anything else I have said. You are not who you were when this happened. Whatever it was, however long ago, whatever it cost you at the time, the person standing at the end of this situation has accumulated something in the interim that the person at the beginning of it did not have. Knowledge of your own resilience. The evidence demonstrated through actual lived experience rather than hopeful theory that you are capable of surviving what you did not think you could survive. That the worst of it did not end you, that something in you kept going, kept building, kept becoming more itself, even in the middle of conditions that did not support that becoming. The person coming back is coming back to a version of you that is considerably more than what they left. Whether you let them discover that fully, partially, or not at all is entirely and completely yours to decide. But know this, you are not in the same position you were in, not emotionally, not energetically, not in terms of what you understand about your own worth and what you will and will not accept in exchange for your presence. You have the upper hand here, not in a tactical sense, in the truest sense. The sense of someone who knows something they did not know before and cannot unknow it and cannot be returned to a state of not knowing it, regardless of how this situation resolves. You have the upper hand here, not in a tactical sense, in the truest sense. The sense of someone who knows something they did not know before and cannot unknow it and cannot be returned to a state of not knowing it, regardless of how this situation resolves. I want to be specific about what that knowing actually is, because naming it matters. You know now what you will and will not accept. That knowledge was probably present before in a theoretical form, But theory and lived experience produce very different kinds of knowing. What you have now is the lived kind, the kind built from having actually experienced what happens when someone fails to honor what you bring, from having felt the specific shape of that failure in your body, rather than simply understood it as an abstraction. That knowledge is not transferable. It cannot be taught. It can only be acquired through the actual experience of its opposite. You have it now. And it means that whatever conversation happens, whatever decision you make about how to receive what is coming, you are making it from a position of genuine clarity rather than the hopeful uncertainty you may have been operating from before. That is a fundamentally different negotiating position, and it belongs entirely to you. That knowing is yours permanently, and it changes everything about how this goes. Whatever you decide,